Welcome to Calcast, your Create International podcast. God Network News, where we give you a new perspective
on events happening in our world today.
This is GNN.
This is God Network News, episode 173. Welcome, GNN fans, to another episode of God Network News, the podcast that tells you what God's doing around the world. Not what CNN tells you, but what GNN tells you is going on in the world. If you're tired of listening to all of that crisis network news and you want to hear what God's doing, well, give us a listen. Greetings, God Network News fans, to another great series that we'll be doing on movements. For these next few weeks, we've got some exciting podcasts that have been recorded by some colleagues of ours, all on the topics of movements, what makes movement leaders, what makes a movement, all kinds of exciting things. We're going to be focusing a lot on what God's doing in this season of missions, which is movements of peoples, whole people groups to Christ. There's amazing things happening, miracles everywhere. One of our organizations that we are partnering with, 2414, is already monitoring 1,360 movements. And each of these movements have over 56,000 new believers among them. And these are just amongst unreached people groups. So God is up to something really fantastic. And we're going to be looking into this in the next few weeks of our podcasts of God Network News. Portions of our podcasts will be made up of rebroadcasted podcast interviews from a friend of ours named Steve Addison. Steve Addison is a great podcaster and very passionate about movements of peoples to Christ. And Steve has his own podcast, very successful podcast with over 226 podcast episodes. And the name of his podcast is On the Road to No Place Left. And we highly recommend that you subscribe to his podcast because he has an overwhelming library of exciting topics related to movements. And if you want to learn more about movements, this is the place to find the information. And he has lots of training and tools and other resources that will really make your investigation of this topic successful. So we really want to thank Steve Addison and his partners there at movements.net/podcast. That's how you can find it, at movements.net/podcast, for all of the resources that he has given us for these next few podcasts. Thank you very much, Steve.
AIMS was an association of various agencies, and this was right in the late 80s when unreached peoples were really starting to get underway. And AIMS would get these requests in from people who said, I want to be a missionary, I want to go to X place. And the way that they would deal with that is they'd go through their filing cabinets and they'd hunt for all the various member agencies that were going to that place, and then they would basically manually type out an answer. And I thought, this is extremely inefficient. And I am a database guy, so I built AIMS's first database of agencies and where they were working. And along the way, discovered a significant amount about places where people were working and places where they were not. And that led me into the whole idea of unreached peoples. And through an extraordinary number of events, I just came to find that my passion, if you will, was for the unreached and trying to figure out why it was that we were not reaching them. And that led me to the World Christian Encyclopedia after my wife and I got married. And I learned from David Barrett a considerable amount about unevangelized and unreached peoples and exactly why we were not reaching them. And a lot of it had to do with deployments and people working among them, and I developed this passion for that. But all along, one of the things that David talked about frequently was the population growth rate exceeded the amount of evangelism and discipleship that was presently happening. And he called it the scandal of the unreached. He constantly referred to it as the church was failing to do its duty, its commission, and he called it the scandal of the unreached. And I guess that really marked me, and I kept trying to think about, what it would take for more workers to be placed amongst the unreached, but also what it would take for the gospel to replicate, to multiply, for lack of a better word, amongst people faster than the population growth rate. I was involved in a lot of different projects over the years, but finally, in the early 2000s, my wife and I and our family were in Southeast Asia, and we were working with a network of people, and we started hearing these things about rapidly multiplying movements, about movements to Christ. And they weren't as, well known or as well documented to this day. But we started hearing these things and started gathering some case studies here and there about things that were happening. And then we came back from Southeast Asia and we migrated into beyond. And that was about the time when we really started collecting these case studies. And slowly but surely, we discovered that there were a lot more of them happening than what most people thought were happening. And by the time that the 2414 initiative got started, we discovered there were, I think at the time of that, there was in the high triple digits of movements, where most people, we were at a meeting and most people knew about it, about 150. But I had documented, I forget the exact number. It was 500, 600, 700 at that point.
Okay. And what
were happening? What
sort of descriptors or definitions were you using to say this is what a movement is?
Sure. The definition that we typically use is it has to be within a boundary. So we typically talk about at least within countries and more likely within provinces and within people groups. So sometimes when people report a movement to me, it'll be we're working in this city, but more typically it's we're working in this people group. And when they talk about a people group, they often are really referring to what Joshua Project would call a cluster.
You're listening to God Network News Podcast with your host, Cal Curtis. Look up our website at godnetworknews.com.
So somebody will come up to me at a conference and you got the big stands of coffee and we'll be standing around the coffee thing and they'll start telling me stories and I'll grab a napkin and I'll be hastily writing, down things. It's typically, we're working amongst this group, this group, this group, and this group. And they're all big clusters. They're all big language groups. They're, not down to the very specific things, but it has to be bounded by some language or they'll say, well, you guys, you mission researchers, you're all about people groups, but we find cities to be important too. And I'm like, yeah, I find cities to be equally important. We talk either in terms of cities or in people groups, because cities are usually a big mishmash of languages. It's a little bit of a different situation. So they'll tell me about that. And then, so a location or a language, and then it has to be it has to be 4 generations of church planting, and not just A to B to C to D, but 4 generations in multiple streams, so that you get that stretching out, that multiplication going. And it has to be adding another generation in a relatively short time frame. So typically what we've found is that most movements can take sometimes years to start. But once they start adding another generation, usually every year to 18 months, something along that line. And that's the kind of growth that we're looking for. That's the kind of pattern that we would like to see. It's not that it always is that speed, but usually it is, especially when the movements are smaller. So they have to be bounded. They have to be 4 generations in multiple streams, and they have to be growing. That's how we define a movement.
Okay. And so how many movements are you aware of right now around the world?
Something like 1375.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
1375 movements, 4,000 plus teams that are, so there's about 4,500 or so teams that are trying to start movements. And in that 4,500, about 1375 have reached what we call level 5. They've reached that 4 generations and they're continuing to grow. And that represents about 79 million believers, or about 1% of the entire world population is in a rapidly multiplying movement today. And
what parts of the world or people groups are we talking about?
Well, it's interesting. It used to be that people would say, well, that works. The first movements that we really documented were basically in Southern Asia. And people would say, well, that works in Southern Asia, but it won't work here, wherever here was. And then somebody would get fed up with the status quo and they'd want to see what happened in South Asia happen here. So they'd try it, and lo and behold, it worked there. And then, someplace else, people would say, well, it worked in those two places, but it can't work here. Ours is a different environment. Well, at this point, we've had enough people try it in enough different places that there are movement teams active on just about every UN region of the world, every continent, every sub-region. There's, I think it's either Polynesia or Micronesia, I forget which, in the Pacific, where we don't have a team or engagement yet, but that's about the only one. And in most of those regions, there's at least one or two movements that have started that, in some places they're quite small still. But in most of those UN regions, there's at least one or two movements. And in some, there's obviously a huge number of movements. So every UN region. Where
are some of the hot spots in terms of regions of the world?
Right across the 1040 window.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. What I have found is that the darker the spot in terms of spiritual darkness, the more likely a movement will start there. It is amongst the spiritually hungry, the most radical spiritual seekers, the most oppressed places, the most lacking in good news. That's where you'll find movements just explode once they ignite. Movements aren't exactly new. There's been movements throughout history. There's been a number of, some of our modern denominations were born out of rapidly multiplying movements. But for the current wave, if you will, the earliest I've tracked it back is to the very early 1990s. And as far as I can tell, there were probably only about 3 or 4 back like at 91, 92 kind of era, 93, somewhere in there. But there certainly were more than we thought. When we thought there were only 150, there were definitely more than we thought then. A lot of these things happened very much under the radar because they are in very sensitive places. They are in places where people don't want to talk about what's going on under the radar, so to speak. But at the same time, there has been phenomenal growth of movements in the past 5 years or so.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider donating to help us continue to bring exciting stories fresh from the field. Visit our website at godnetworknews.com and select the PayPal link on the right side of the page, or consider becoming a Patreon partner to receive access to more valuable materials exclusive to our members.